Hello to anyone watching this. As the Nintendo Warriors franchise has continued to only represent two different Nintendo franchises, it only makes people more and more want to see different series represented. And for me, the one that I've wanted to see the most is definitely Pokemon. I just think it has so much potential for its standard gameplay to translate into a really compelling Warriors experience. So today I just wanted to put out a concept for what it could look like based on the rough outlines of the previous Nintendo Warriors games. And by that I basically just mean in terms of its roster size, its suite of modes, how the stages could look, just all the basic things like that. Like, I hope no one would think every single Pokemon would be playable in this game, but you know, I just want to make it clear that I'm only ever possibly expecting a roster of like 30 at the absolute most for a game like this. But just in general, I've always really enjoyed seeing how all of the different Nintendo Warriors games have come together in the end, and I'm really interested in thinking about what a Pokemon version of that could look like. You know, all of this is just for fun, and I genuinely do not expect a Pokemon Warriors game to ever be made. It's just like I said, I think it could be really easily translated into a Warriors game, so you know, there's no harm in thinking about it. So, let's start with the characters, or more interestingly, to me at least, the character progression system, because I've always found this to be one of the most compelling parts of each of these games, you know, going into a shop menu and picking out new badges based on all of the materials that you've collected. I just find it really compelling to incrementally improve characters using this sort of system. And I do think that can be quite easily translated into a Pokemon game, you know? It's just a matter of having each of the materials plainly be represented by each of the different types. You know, say like Flabébé is a little enemy Pokemon, you kill it, murder it, slaughter it, and you get a little fairy crystal that can be put into a Pokemon that can use it. I think the best example would be for the defense part of the upgrade. You know, in previous games like Hyrule Warriors, you could improve your defense against each different element, except, you know, there are 18 here, and that would be slightly ridiculous to have a different bit for every single one of them. So I think slimlining it down to improving defense against Pokemon that each of them are strong, neutral and weak to is the best way of going about it. You know, say you got your little fairy crystal, that means that a dragon Pokemon can put it into its defenses and make it slightly more strong against fairy type Pokemon. It would be a bit of a grind to get each of the materials, but that's just what you sign up for these games, and I think this could potentially be alleviated because you know exactly what type of material you'll get from each Pokemon, so you'll easily be able to find a battle that has a lot of ice types or fairy types, be able to go into them, collect those materials, and then be able to make your dragon Pokemon stronger against what it's weak to. You know, it's quite a simple system, but I just think it works for this sort of game. And obviously all the different typed materials will apply less specifically to the attack and boost badges you can get. You know, like Hyrule Warriors was very weird about exactly what materials you needed to give each character, so they clearly don't care that much about that, and they really don't need to. So if you use electric crystals to boost a poison type Pokemon, you know, fair's fair. And in terms of the bronze, silver and gold rarities that they like to split each of the different types of materials into, I think you can just have like different sized crystals for each different one, and it'll make sense. The previous Warriors games have had character-specific materials be gold, but I really don't think you need that here, you know? Just have playable Pokemon give out gold versions of material that are just the big crystals, and you'll be fine. And while I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, if this game does have a Pokemon catching element to it, and you can catch multiples of the same different type of Pokemon, I'd just have it so that they give the main playable version that you have a boost of EXP, a few bronze and silver crystals, and then you just let them free into the wild. You know, no implications that they've been like squashed down into crystals or something like that. Just let them free and let them leave behind some crystals. You know, it's all fine. My other main big idea for character progression in this game is evolution. You know, it would be quite similar to class changing from Fire Emblem Warriors here. You know, you evolve the Pokemon and you can unlock more badges, including increased combo, more Muso attacks, all stuff like that. And I do want progression to be consistent with each of the playable Pokemon, so all of my choices here are 3-stage evolutions. And so they get 2 big upgrades as you level them up. Like, yeah, it was cool that Fire Emblem Warriors had the class seals that enabled the upgrade, but, you know, for Pokemon it just makes sense to have it all be done through leveling up. Another thing that I don't think can be brought over from Fire Emblem Warriors is getting to keep the unupgraded versions of these characters as different costumes. Like, for example, you know, I don't think it's going to be that much of a spoiler to say that my choice for a Fire-type Pokemon here is Charizard, and for his later combos I can quite easily imagine him using flying-type attacks, you know, going up into the air, flapping his wings about, and, you know, that sort of thing doesn't really apply to Charmander, so while it would be cool to keep all of the previous evolutions as costumes, I just don't think it'll work here if you want to have the final evolutions to have the big grand attacks that you'd want them to. But at the same time, I think the whole evolving moveset thing can help keep the earlier versions more interesting, because with Charmander he can have a little flamethrower move as his first strong attack that can get bigger and bigger as he evolves, you know? It's another good sense of character progression you can get from each Pokemon here. But while standardly progressing, evolving Pokemon is all well and good to have, I think it'd be nice to be balanced out with some legendary Pokemon that wouldn't need any evolving and would have full access to every single upgrade as soon as you get them through progressing through the story or something like that. They'd obviously be harder to obtain than the standard Pokemon, but I think the big caveat to them would just be the fact that they need more materials to get their upgrades, so you can't just instantly make them overpowered compared to everything else as soon as you get them, you know? I think that's a good way to balance it out, and it also gives you a choice between whether you want to focus on evolving a Pokemon or just purely focus on upgrading a Pokemon. So now that I've gone through how I'd want to handle training each of these Pokemon, it's time to start naming names, and the way that I've built this roster is to have 1 Pokemon of each different type with 2 from each different generation, and then 1 legendary from each generation, all of which being a different type. You know, I think a nice balanced representation of 3 from each generation just makes the most sense to me. Even though we've seen with games like Pokken that that's not really a focus, it would just be nice to have that here, especially if you want to represent every single different type. You know, that divides by 9 right now, so it just makes sense to go for it, in my opinion. And since I've given myself the restriction of having every single Pokemon have 3 different evolutions, I like to hope I've made some interesting choices here, especially with the legendaries. Like, I don't know, I feel that every Pokemon has its fan base, but I think this will really help big up some names that otherwise don't get as much attention as they could. So I'm just going to go generation to generation and try and explain my choices, starting with Gen 1. I know I did say I was trying to make some interesting choices, but it's like, if you're only going to pick 3 Pokemon to represent Gen 1 in a game that represents all the Pokemon, like, you are quite restricted with what you can choose without it just not making any sense why you would exclude any of these 3 buggers. Gen 2 I like to hope is a bit more interestingly represented, like, yeah, Tyranitar's a fan favourite and Lugia's a box Pokemon, but you know, Jumpluff's a bit of a wild choice, right? You know, we love a good floaty character in these games when they're not extremely slow as well. With Gen 3, it was just kind of irresistible to not pick this trio, you know, especially Gardevoir I think always deserves to turn up. Definitely not going to get a Gallade costume here because that would just be incredibly weird. You know, Gardevoir's already going to have a quirky enough moveset, it doesn't need to have like a fighting stance put on top of it in any way. Gen 4 has our first example of technically cheating with Mamoswine because obviously his pre-evolutions turned up in Gen 2, but I don't know, I just class the final evolution as the generation that's representing here, so it counts as Gen 4, and you know, the other 2 are perfectly reasonable choices, like, you just can't escape from Garchomp at this point, and I certainly don't mind. Gen 5 could only possibly be made up of quirky picks, especially Vanillux, who I just think is extremely overhated. I've always found him to be an extremely cute idea for a Pokemon that, to be honest, I would absolutely take as a Piranha Plant style twist purchase bonus character in Smash Bros. You know, that's all I'm going to say about him. The others are cool as well. Gen 6 has another inevitable fan favourite starter with Greninja, alongside a couple other Pokemon that I just really appreciate. I don't think I would have jumped to Aegislash as quickly as I did if I wasn't a Pokken fan, but you know, I still think he's just a really cool pick. Gen 7 has our last fan favourite starter with Decidueye, which I think could get away with having its Hisuian version and still be counted as Gen 7, but just to be safe, I'm going to have its standard version here, alongside Vikavolt, who, considering how many choices there were for a 3-stage bug-type Pokemon, he's extremely lucky he got picked here. And Magierna I've always just thought to be quite cool, mainly just because of how early she was shown off before Gen 7. With Gen 8, I do think that Mr. Rime does properly count as a regional form for this generation specifically, alongside Grimmsnarl, who just seems like a generally popular yet somehow underrated pick. You know, I just think Gen 8 didn't have the most robust choices, but I am still satisfied with this bunch. And finally, Gen 9 has the other form of cheating you'd expect from this sort of list, as Mousehold is obviously only a 2-stage evolution, but I think if you can have it jump from its family of 3 to family of 4, that counts well enough. You know, I thought it was such a quirky Pokemon that seems like it'd make just an incredible Warriors moveset, so I really just wanted it here. Alongside that, Chien Pao is just a really interesting choice for a legendary. You know, it's one of those ones that's more off to the side, it's not advertised as much, and I think that's a good thing to have here amongst the big name legendaries. So that's the main roster sorted, but I did want to go through some DLC picks as well, as you know, that's been quite a consistent thing amongst all of the Nintendo Warriors games. Apart from with Free Hopes, which I'm still not over, but you know, just move on from that, focus on this game. So I went with 3 packs with 3 more Pokemon in each, 1 from every single generation, and each of them being a type that's not represented by one of the legendaries in the main game, meaning that each type will overall have 2 Pokemon, and I think this is quite a quirky group of ones that I really don't think would make the base game compared to the ones that we have there. But I just think as DLC picks, these are absolutely ones that I would adore picking up and playing. Especially Nidoking as a more quirky representative of Gen 1. So yeah, this is my overall selection of Pokemon for this game. It was an absolute puzzle trying to put together every single thing to make sure it represented one of each type and two of each generation, but you know, I got there in the end. In terms of movesets, I'm not really going to go into that because it's not really something I think about with Warriors games. I just get what I'm given, and especially with Pokemon, you know, even you as a viewer could probably come up with a perfect moveset for anyone. Just imagine exactly how you want them to move and attack, and that's probably what the developers would go for. It's one of my favourite parts of these Nintendo Warriors games, like especially the original Hyrule Warriors with characters like Marin and Zelda with her rapier. They just move in the exact way you want them to. It's really satisfying, so I almost don't need to go into moveset speculation here. One little naggy mechanic thing I'd like to mention with these movesets though is what type of damage they'd all be dealing. Like with Charizard, obviously a flamethrower would be fire and a wing attack would be flying, but for the more basic slash claw attacks you could imagine him having, I'd still give that fire type damage, because if all of those types of moves were normal, it would just make the game not as fun or interesting to think through how you're going to attack something, you know? So I'd give all of the basic attacks the type that that Pokemon has. And in terms of dual typing, that can still be here. But with Garchomp, if he does a regular slash, that will just be his main typing, rather than one slash being ground, then the next being dragon, you know? Just keep everything consistent to the main type of attacks, but still give them the defense of their dual typings. But obviously, if you're only playing as one Pokemon, you'll almost inevitably bump into ones that you can't really efficiently deal with. And my main way to get around this, while still making it fair, is to just work with the team system from the Pokemon games. As obviously, if these are all caught Pokemon and they're probably tied to a trainer, you can have up to 6 in a team, although I'd probably make it more like 4 going out into battle at once, all controlled from the same point. Like you switch out, you know, it's not like Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity where you can spread out your party across the map. Like you'll all just be together and get swapped out whenever you want. But if you don't want to swap out, you'll probably be able to hold a trigger button and press one of the directional buttons and send out someone else in your team to deal damage purely based on their type, which will be good to cover on a battle where you're otherwise quite weak. You know, I think it's just a good way to cover for that, and it might even be good if there are gimmick battles where you can't switch out but you can still bring in the rest of your team, you know? Then it's even more useful to pick ones you can send out and have them deal super effective damage, you know? I just think it's a fun way to integrate the team-based nature of Pokemon while still having the being able to deal with all the hundreds of enemies in front of you nature of the Dynasty Warriors series. So now I want to talk about the different modes that I'd expect to see in this game, and there are only 2 main ones, you know, your story mode and your equivalent to adventure mode or legend mode, you know, the more freeing mode, even though there's probably going to be a free play mode from the story, but it'll all make sense. So for the main story mode, I don't think it'd be all too needed to have some grand adventure across a new or returning region, recreating areas from it in the form of battlefields. That just doesn't feel needed here. I feel like something more akin to Pokken story mode, where you just go against a gauntlet of people, makes more sense for this type of game, but obviously I do still want structure to it. So the way I'd do it would be to have 18 different story modes, 1 for each type, which definitely sounds like a lot, but all they would be is basically like arcade ladders, where you start at the beginner rank and then slowly move your way up until you face a champion. I'd give each different type its own special trainer that you play as during that story, and then you go against all the other ones throughout it. And I'd have each campaign be about 12 battles, and you face against every other different type, you know, with some battles having you go against 2 at once, and each one having a different objective that you have to clear before you can take on the main big Pokemon, whether that's capturing keeps or getting so many kills or having to defeat certain officer type Pokemon and then going to the final battle. You know, I think something like that is what this game would work best as having for a story mode. In terms of unlocking all of the different characters, I'd set it so that when you first boot up the game, you're immediately shoved into the story mode and pick your first type. So if you went for fire, you'd instantly get Charmander for the main roster when you play in free play mode, and then each of the different battles would give you an opportunity at some point to catch each of the Pokemon from every single different type. So if your first battle is against grass, you'd bump into a little Rowlet that you get the opportunity to catch. It may be sort of out of the way of the main battle and take an extra minute or so, but you'd always get a 100% chance of catching it if you can defeat it, and then that's added to your main roster, and then you can add it to your team before you go into the next battle, and so on and so forth. And when you get to the end of that ladder, you're allowed to then pick any of the other ladders of the other Pokemon you've caught. So it'd be a fair system where with one playthrough you'll be able to get through any other story you want afterwards, or you may even have to play the first one again and again if you're like a 5-year-old and don't understand the nature of catching Pokemon, you know? It'd be a fun time no matter what. In terms of catching the legendary Pokemon, I'd have it be slightly different, where once you complete the ladder for that legendary's type, as well as a different type, you know, any different type that's not associated with a legendary, you know, I won't make it that complicated, then you get a special little bonus story of literally just 2 battles, one where you catch legendary and another where you're made to play as a legendary for a rather tough battle. And once you do that, you unlock the right to play the next legendary story. So that's, once again, you can play it however you want. You can do all 18 normal stories and then do all 9 legendary stories, or every 2 normal stories you can do the legendary and then have instant access to the next one once you complete 2 more ladders. You know, I think that's a sort of fun branching story that I'd really appreciate for this game, at least. So now I'd like to quickly go through the different types of enemy Pokemon I'd expect to see. I'm not going to go through every single specific one that I'd want to appear, because that's just an entirely different logistic situation on its own that I don't want to go through again. You know, I've only just sorted out what Pokemon I want playable, but basically in the Warriors games you have your little foot soldiers, you have the slightly bigger ones that have a health bar you can see that are sort of in charge of a keep or a part of their own cluster of little guys, and then you have a bigger enemy that probably takes a load of hits to take down and often has a more special, unique move. So I'd have it where each type has a first evolution of a Pokemon and a second evolution be the sort of middle range enemy, and then either the third evolution or a completely different fully evolved Pokemon be the big enemy from that type. And they would obviously be faceable alongside the playable Pokemon, which, especially in the story mode, would appear probably in different contexts. Like, if you're on the fire ladder, in your first battle against the grass types, you'd only have like the one Rowlet that you can catch and then a Daytrix at the end of the battle. But as you get further up the ladder, you know, if the final battle's against the water Pokemon, then you'd have a little Froakie off to the side you can catch, and then Frogadiers sort of scattered about the place that are taken on almost as playable characters, and then a fully evolved Greninja at the end. You know, it'd be different battle to battle, but obviously it would get harder as you go up. The only other type of NPC enemy Pokemon would be legendaries, and these would be much more akin to the bosses from Hyrule Warriors and not like Oboro and Niles in Fire Emblem Warriors, who should have been in the first playable roster but were later just segmented to DLC. Like, these will be specifically made to be taken on, and I'd have this be Terrapagos, Arceus and Silvally, because all three of them can in some way change type, but in this game I just make it like snap your finger, they can be any type they want, so that you probably have to think about what Pokemon you're putting against them, what other types you take with you, so you can cover pretty much everything that they can do. You know, it'd just be like a proper little extra layer of strategy when taking on this boss, and not just throwing an item at them at the perfect moment. And in terms of where you'd actually get to fight them, I'd have them almost randomly appear at the end of like your 6th, 12th and 18th completed ladders as just sort of an extra boss just chucked onto the battlefield to take on as like a bonus little surprise. And then once you've taken on all 18 normal ladders and 9 extra legendary stories, there'd be a bonus set of 5 missions where you take on all of the different legendaries again, and that would be like the final story of the game. And once you complete that, that's it, you've done all the story mode. And you may be thinking that 347 near identical battles with samey enemies and stages would be mind-numbingly repetitive, and yeah, duh, it's a Warriors game, that's sort of how they roll. The number of missions is a lot more quantity over quality, but quality is a bit of a harsh word to put below quantity here, because you've still got compelling objectives. It's just about how willing you are to do them again and again in a short enough space of time. You know, it's just normal Warriors fare to have that much stuff looping. In terms of the actual stages that you fight on, I thought the best idea would be to just give a thematic biome to each of the different types. So, you know, a nice steel work for steel, a volcano for fire, basic stuff like that. You know, about half the size of a regular Warrior stage with plenty of room for different paths and keeps that keep them all interesting. And then they can all have triangular exits to each other, so they can be easily clipped on to make combinations of up to 3 different stages at once, depending on what type of battle that you're doing. It does mean for each of the different ladders that you'd start on the exact same half stage, but you know, you can just keep rotating it to keep it interesting every single time, like you're always going out a different exit to a different place. I think it balances itself out. And for the legendaries, they can just share the same overall stage layout, but just sort of dramatically scatter in elements from the biome of their own type, you know? Sort of dark and mysterious steelworks. So now I've covered my idea for the story mode, I'd like to cover my idea for the equivalent of adventure mode, which I'd like to call journey mode, which is basically just putting up a map of a region and then squaring it off, similar to the adventure mode of Hyrule Warriors, and just like going route to route, town to town, city to city, taking on every single gym leader, collecting all the badges, and then going to the Elite Four. You know, I think this is best illustrated with the lovely squareness of Kanto. You know, just turn it into a massive grid, put a battle on every single thing, and let you unlock extra cosmetics for your trainer and Pokemon, and just fun stuff like that. You know, it's more of the same, but that's all that the adventure modes have ever been. And then if you have Kanto, you can obviously connect onto Johto, and then maybe Hoenn and Sinnoh. I'd expect those 4 to make up the base game, and then maybe Unova, Kalos and Alola can come with each of the 3 DLC packs, you know? It's quite a simple extra journey mode, and it reuses a lot of assets, but I think it just makes the most sense for a game like this to represent all of the different regions like that. So now we've gotten all the main modes out the way, it's time to get onto the extra bits. Now, obviously you'll have your options mode and your gallery mode to display all the different Pokemon, but in terms of the more frequently appearing collectibles, obviously you have the Sculptures and Anna's shop from Hyrule and Fire Emblem Warriors, and I think the best equivalent to that would be Pokédex entries, where if you complete the objective, like kill so many enemies or capture so many keeps in a certain amount of time, a Pokédex entry will sort of appear on the battlefield, or maybe you'll have to chase down a Pokemon known for stealing pages from books. I'm sure there's one of them out there at this point. And all the different entries can be scattered across the story mode and journey modes. You know, I'd hope for each generation to get a picture of all 3 of their Pokemon and all the NPCs in the background. So 9 total pictures, and they normally have 20 little images each, which totals to 180, which is hopefully the total amount of playable and non-playable Pokemon put together. And if you finish one of the pictures, you get a bonus mission in journey mode that gets you a really cool cosmetic, or absolutely nothing if we're going by Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition standards. You know, it's all fun. So I'm probably just rambling about something that really doesn't matter at this point, but I don't know, I've always just found these things to be cool collectibles, and I hope that they can continue, considering that they weren't in the past couple of games. And if this is more of a refresh, you know, who knows, it could want to go back to basics in that regard. And the final thing I'd like to talk about is the items, which there's not really much to talk about, you know, potions, X, attack, defense, etc, etc. All those sorts of things can be easily carried over for cute little references, you know. You're not going to need your repels and escape ropes in this game. It's just a basic little set of items. You can only bring so many of into each battle, but you can collect them and stack them up so you can have more of a reserve for next time, you know, stuff like that. All fun. So yeah, that's just about all the ideas I have for this game. Everything else really falls into place after that, you know, like the graphical style and stuff like that I could care less for, you know. I played Hyrule Warriors Legends on an original 3DS and didn't complain, so I'll take absolute garbage if it means I get to play more Warriors. Just like I said, this is the series that I think deserves a Warriors game the most at this point, apart from like Nintendo as an overall company, you know, Smash Bros style, but I think that's even less likely than a Pokemon game, to be fair. But yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, do let me know. Just the best reason to think that we would get a Pokemon Warriors game is the fact that there was the Samurai Warriors crossover with Pokemon, you know, Pokemon Conquest back in 2012, so who knows, this could just be a straight up crossover with normal Dynasty Warriors, you know? Ji-Hao Yuan and Incineroar teaming up would fulfill several of my fantasies at once, to be fair. But bye-bye, have a nice day.